Yes, so this work, the performance that was done, which is the Unmistakable Air of Triumph, is really an outgrowth of my work in general, which is looking at notions of victory and of triumph and the ways in which, as a form, there's been a proliferation of an iconography that's connected to domination, that's connected to oppression, and that's connected to imperialism. And so I'm interested in the way in which this Arc de Triomf that is in Barcelona is designed to celebrate the triumph of the arts, and what it means for the triumph of the arts to be aligned with all these understandings of domination, oppression, and violence. The art itself that was put up comes from a body of work that was done in Santander in the context of the grant that I got from the Fundación Botín, and it takes its form from an ancient Roman triumphal arch that was erected in Libya. And I'm interested in the way in which that arc, with Libya becoming an Italian colony later, more modern times, the first gesture that they did was to restore that arch. And so there's this idea of caring for a legacy of domination, oppression, and so on. And so all those things are layered into this work that looks at this arch in this park in Barcelona, thinks about the fact that this park comes about by the clearing out of a neighborhood to celebrate a certain modernity in relation to an international view of what's happening in Spain in that moment. Yeah, so I use sound to sort of reference and think about different moments of history and to collapse those in a way that is really visceral. So you don't have to know the reference point to appreciate what it's doing. Sound activates this performance in a way that is about producing the possibility for collective mourning. And this particular sound is an elaboration of a couple different reference points. One of those is a song that's, in English it's called The Four Insurgent Generals. It was sung by Paul Robeson, amongst others, but it comes from the Spanish Civil War specifically, and Paul Robeson's involvement in the Spanish Civil War. He sings it also in Spanish. Then the other one is a song that's called 2000 AD, it's by Erykah Badu, and it's a song that the opening lines says, "You won't be naming no building after me to go down dilapidated." And she says, "My name won't be misstated." But really the part that captures me in that song is the fact that she says, "This world has changed so much since I've been conscious." And so it's about this state of consciousness that makes all of those things that might have been possible to celebrate an impossibility. I think, for me, in order to sort of resist the temptation of triumph, it's like creating this arch that you're not supposed to walk through. And actually walking through it, maybe there's this form of transformation, but maybe not. There's an obstacle, so the bottom of the frame makes you, so you can't easily walk through. You have to step over something. There's an obstacle to it. But then also, it's typical of arches in Roman history to have been built in a way that you could proceed from one to the next so that you would be aligned in order with this whole series of histories. And so I thought it was important to create this dimension where, in a certain sense it's erected there to be aligned with this whole potential history. But at the same time, it's designed to be fleeting, to be temporary, and for me and my work, the idea of working in a way that is about a certain temporary structure is so important to me because it resists what I call the arrogance of permanence, which I think is something that has to do with human beings in general, desire to exist. I think a lot of artists think about it, about what it means to have something. Is this archivable? Will it be here for life? And I find a certain arrogance in leaving that behind and a desire to leave that behind, and it's based on an entire trajectory of art history that has celebrated and venerated that, and a lot of that has to do with leaving lasting signs of a certain power I think there's other ways to do it, and I think there's other ways to understand legacy that are not about these sort of physical traces that are left on the earth. In my work, I think that patterns have always been important. Patterns in my work really emerged from working with quilts, working with fabric, textiles, and that world of textiles came to me through my mother, and it came to my mother through her mother, and to her mother through her mother. And so it's this intergenerational thing, mainly passed amongst women, but that my artistic sensitivity brought me there, right? And so I was very interested in making those things and caring for them. And I'm interested in the fragmentation of quilts, where they're made up of all these different pieces of textile that can come from different specific histories and that come together in their making. But I think in terms of pattern, right, there's an antiquity to patterns. Those are not, those quilting patterns, we have names for them in the quilting vocabulary. But there are different names for them in architectural vocabulary. And I'm interested in the fact that really we just changed the name, but it's the same structure, the same patterns that show up. In this case, I wanted to do this on the surface of the of these arches because they were covered then with canvases. And in being covered with canvas, you're hiding the sort of decoration. And then once you reveal it, I think there's a certain value that's given to artisanal processes that require great labor, like marble inlay, wooden inlay. These are things that we really, really respect. And I've been interested in what it means to sort of make something that looks like that. They can convince you of it for a little while, but then when you go up, you understand it's fiction, it's fake. And it's the value is not about its materiality, right? It's something that it extends beyond that. So I'm interested in questioning value in general, and for me, those patterns, the way that they can fool you into thinking that there's like this real elegance and care, it's all an illusion, right? And I think that when we think about architectural history as well, history monuments, when you go into palaces, right, they give you that care, and it extends itself into value. But I think we have to be willing to question the fiction of the construction of that value. So I'm always curious about where we decide to lower the historical anchor, because I think a lot of like claims, especially for land, I mean, you can look at the northern part of Morocco and understand that relation to Spain. These claims to land, right, are anchored in when you want to say we lower our historical anchor. So if we say, look, Spain was there, centuries ago, we say, okay, that's one way of looking and thinking about geography, right? But does it really have anything to do with that specific moment in terms of a claim to land, right? And what does it mean to create a boundary around that, and what it means in relation to the historical relationships that have existed between Spain and North Africa, right? And the ways in which those things are simply underscored and carried forth. So I think there's a lot of things that really, really need to be challenged, because if we want to, not far from like Ceuta, there is also Volubilis, which was a Roman, colony. And so if Italians wanted to, they'd say, hey, we were there earlier, and maybe it should belong to Italy. And so these are these really, I think, sort of silly, in a certain sense, contestations of land that are extremely obvious in their interest in certain forms of holding on to the colonial past, not letting go. And I think the lack of willingness to really engage in a very basic critical conversation about that is evident in a lot of places. It's evident in the context of the United States that the United States is still colonized, right? It's still occupation of land. So now we have a great interest in stating that. When people speak from a university, they'll tell you whose land it's on. But they say it without an interest in ever doing something to rectify that. There's not an interest in giving that land back. And so I ask myself what it means to actually state that it's been stolen from these people. It's a start, I guess. But what does it mean to say we stole this land and we're still on it and we will continue to be on it? So this object, which was part of the performance, comes from a series of bulletproof vests that I was creating, objects that look like bulletproof vests. In a period of the early 2000s when what was exported of African American culture was mainly hip hop, strangely, hip hop and sports in Europe. I was interested in this figure of 50 Cent and how he was always wearing this bulletproof vest, and it was all about how he had survived all these gunshots, and he actually inspired a fashion where people were wearing bulletproof vests that weren't real. They were just fake to look like it, and so they were actually putting themselves at risk, right, by wearing them. And at the same time, I had encountered this textile tradition, which happens actually in a number of different parts of the African continent, but is a form of quilted armor. And inside the Ethnographic Museum of Florence, I had done some work in dialogue with this quilted armor because it was collected from a battlefield where this army resisted colonial expansion, the arrival of Italians, and lost. And their armor was collected and displayed in a museum. And so what does it mean to take armor off of a body, right, that represents resistance, and put it in a museum to talk about how exciting and exotic this culture actually is, right? And so I was interested in the mixture of those things and what it might mean for quilts and the power, the spiritual power of quilts to give a spiritual protection to people, right? And so, and also, I mean, there's something really, really super hyper-masculine about all of the violence that's celebrated in that way through 50 Cent. That I also felt needed to be a little bit cared for and tamed. And so, this was my attempt to do that years ago. But this specific piece is one of the earlier ones that I made, and I integrated into it this centerpiece right across the heart, which is actually a fragment from my great-grandmother's quilt. And so my great-grandmother was a quilter, and I don't know that much about the context in which she made it, but I know that my mother continues to make quilts for children when they're born. It's meant to keep you warm, but then it also is like a token of good luck, of care. And I like the layering of those things, that this could be somehow a token of care, maybe of luck, but then also it has this sort of physical ability to keep you warm. As an artist, I like to work on collaborations. I always collaborate with many, many different people. And these pieces are always collaborations with quilters, people that were working on quilts, because it's made up of fragments that come from quilts. There's a practice of selling quilts that are damaged, they're broken, stained, or just old for very little money, because they're designed to then be cut up into pillows. They're called cutter quilts. And I'm interested in sort of taking those cutter quilts and transforming them into sculpture as a form of collaboration with whoever was making these things, because I know enough about textiles and I know about sewing to know how much time it takes to do that. And so then to be abandoning these things, I think is something to think about. And yeah, I mean, there's a meditation in sewing, right? There was a period when I decided that I wasn't interested in the world of oil paint any longer. I had been trained in that way, but oil painting, the history of oil painting, the works that I knew of living in Italy, I didn't want to be affiliated with it. And so I convinced myself that I should not be painting, and I stopped for 8 years. And in those 8 years, the only thing I did was sew. So I sewed for 8 years, and these are some of the outgrowth of that. So this was later, but it's me holding on to what that was, because the practice of sewing is very ritual. It takes, maybe it doesn't take that much concentration, but there's something that has to happen for you to spend time doing it. It has the capacity to be social, so you can sit there and talk to somebody the whole time you're doing it. It's portable, so you can bring it places and do it. You can do it in public space, at different sites. And I've always really appreciated that. And then the performance of it as well. I like the gesture of sewing something together. In my work, everything is sort of like has a trial run. And so actually all of those sculptures are probably still waiting for me to go and reawaken them through performance, because when I was doing that work, I wasn't doing performance. And so I don't think I would have even thought of what to do. And now they're waiting, you know, and so maybe there's a way to wake those back up. You know, a lot of the works I think that I create years later, maybe 10 years later, maybe 12 years later, I understand some things that are possible with those works that I couldn't understand when I was making them. And so I think there's always this possibility to go back to the thing and to spend time with it. And almost all of my work has to do with performance, and so it can be activated at any time, you know? And I think it's really important. There's a ritual to the activation of it. So putting the sculpture up in front of it, the Arc de Triomphe, for me was like this opportunity to activate it. These sculptures, which, you know, have been made now for some time, but which have so much power. And I think the way that they maintain that power for me, just like any monument, right? They need to be activated again. They need to continuously be activated. And that process each time develops into a new understanding, a new layer, a new audience, a new everything in relation to it, a new way of thinking. Because of course now, Botin, that was 2013 and 2014, and a lot's changed in the way that I think about things, but these symbols have remained, of course, and so I have a different relationship to them. My interaction with them is going to be different. Understanding or comprehension is not important. I think actually some of what I'm interested in is pushing an audience for art to appreciate that understanding is not what you should be trying to arrive at when you look at work. When you walk up to work, we're not trying to understand it, we're trying to engage it, right? And that takes work on your behalf. You have to do work. In that work, there's not really a wrong way to do it. And I think that a lot of those preconceptions keep people away from art. And when you bring things into public space, you're bringing them into an audience that is not necessarily interested. And so it's really important to do that. Because maybe they're not interested in the context of Barcelona, which has such a rich history of street performers. Probably that performance is understood as that. It's understood as performance in the sense of, I don't know, a dance or, you know, puppetry or juggling, right? And that's great, because people feel like they don't have to dive in and try to understand that. They just experience it and think about it. And so I think it's good to end up in different trajectories of reflection. For me, performance, it's just another form of language, right? So people could probably walk into the sculpture and appreciate certain things, but when you see most of my work, you understand that somebody not only has made it, but could still do something to it. So the presence of that guitar helps you understand the way this is an instrument. The whole thing is an instrument. And so what do we use this tool, what do we use this instrument for? And I think when we think about the history of monuments, it's an instrument, right? They're always an instrument. Usually what they're trying to do is to replay certain forms of violence, but it's not about what they were designed to do. They're instruments, so what do we want to use them to do? And that's really what's important to me.